Welcome to the Alpha Mediumship Academy podcast, a space for intuition, mediumship, and spiritual growth. I'm Joy L, and each week we explore conscious development, awareness, and the deeper side of spiritual experience. So wherever you are, settle in and let's begin. Welcome to the Alpha Mediumship Academy podcast. I'm Joy L, founder of Alpha Mediumship Academy. And before we get into today's episode, I just want to say something very honestly. I have been waiting to create this podcast for a long time. Not because I didn't have things to say, clearly I do, but because I wanted to wait until I could create this from a place that felt grounded and intentional instead of rushed or performative. And honestly, that word performative is probably one of the best ways to begin this conversation. Because today we're talking about what evidential mediumship really is and what it isn't. And there is so much noise surrounding this subject right now. So much performance, so much confusion, so much pressure for everything spiritual to either look dramatic, aesthetic, emotionally overwhelming, or instantly profound. And meanwhile, there are people quietly sitting at home, genuinely trying to understand what they're experiencing, trying to understand what's intuition, what's anxiety, what's imagination, what's spirit communication, and whether they're slowly losing their mind or spiritually awakening, which honestly, in the beginning, can feel alarmingly similar. And I say that lovingly because my own experiences did not begin subtly. I know sometimes people talk about spiritual development like I just slowly became more intuitive over time. That was not my experience. My experiences were strong very early on. I did hear things. I did see things. I had moments that felt deeply unexplainable to me at the time. And if I'm being honest, part of what made it difficult wasn't just the experiences themselves. It was trying to understand what they actually meant, because having experiences and understanding experiences are not the same thing. That distinction changed my life, and it's the reason I care so much about structure, discernment, and grounded development now. Because intensity does not automatically equal clarity. And that's something I wish more people talked about. You know what's interesting? People assume spiritual experiences automatically make you feel certain. Sometimes they do the opposite. Sometimes they make you question reality more deeply than you ever have before. Because suddenly your mind is trying to organize experiences it has no framework for. And your brain really does not enjoy that. The brain likes categories. The brain likes stability. The brain likes, this goes here, that goes there, this makes sense. And spiritual experiences sometimes arrive like, absolutely not. We're dissolving your categories tonight, which is rude, honestly. Very transformative, but rude. And I remember going through periods where I would try to act completely normal externally, while internally thinking, okay, either consciousness is much stranger than I realized, or I need a nap and several psychological evaluations. And the funny thing is, a lot of spiritually sensitive people are walking around having these deeply internal experiences while still paying bills, answering emails, folding laundry, pretending everything is completely ordinary. That contrast fascinates me Because spirituality is often presented online as this glamorous mystical identity, but real development is much stranger and much more human than that. Sometimes mediumship development looks less like I have transcended and more like I am trying to buy groceries while quietly wondering why I just received what feels like symbolic information next to avocados. Nobody talks about that part enough. So today, I want to slow everything down. No performance, no exaggeration, no spiritual theater. Just an honest conversation about what evidential mediumship actually is, what it is not, why people become confused, why strong experiences do not always create clarity, and why discernment matters more than dramatics. Because I think a lot of people are exhausted, not by spirituality itself, but by the noise surrounding it. And I want this podcast to feel different. I want it to feel intelligent, grounded, thoughtful, curious. A place where we can discuss profound things without losing our humanity in the process. And honestly, probably laugh sometimes too. Because if your spiritual path has humbled you properly, you eventually develop a sense of humor. You have to. Otherwise, you spend years dramatically analyzing every coincidence like you're starring in your own psychological mystery series, which, spiritually speaking, many people are. Now, when most people hear the word mediumship, they immediately picture extremes. Either someone sitting in candlelight dramatically speaking to spirits every 5 seconds, or someone who appears completely mystical and emotionally overwhelmed at all times. And I understand why. That's often how mediumship is portrayed. But the truth is, evidential mediumship is far more nuanced than people realize. And honestly, far less glamorous. There are moments that feel profound, absolutely. Moments that genuinely shift your understanding of consciousness and connection. But there are also moments that are deeply subtle, quiet moments. Moments where you question yourself. Moments where you realize perception is much more delicate than you imagine. And that's important because one of the biggest misconceptions is if something is real spiritually, it should feel loud and obvious. Not necessarily. Sometimes the clearest information arrives very calmly, without emotional intensity, without fireworks, without dramatic music playing in the background, unfortunately. And I think social media has made this more confusing because now spirituality is often packaged visually. Everything has to appear mystical, aesthetic, dramatic, emotionally intense. Meanwhile, genuine perception often enters awareness quietly, almost gently, and beginners miss it because they're waiting for something cinematic. People think, surely spirit communication must feel extremely supernatural. And sometimes it can, but often it feels strangely natural, which is part of why people dismiss their own experiences initially. Because they expect the extraordinary to arrive in extraordinary packaging. But consciousness is more subtle than that. And honestly, another reason people get confused is because human beings are meaning making creatures. We want conclusions quickly, we want certainty immediately. The second something unusual happens, the mind wants to decide what it means, where it came from, whether it's spiritual, whether it's psychological, whether it's intuition, whether it's imagination. And the uncomfortable truth is, sometimes discernment takes time, which people hate. We live in a culture that wants immediate certainty about everything, but real spiritual development requires the ability to sit inside ambiguity sometimes. And ambiguity is deeply uncomfortable for the human nervous system, especially if you're already sensitive. I remember early on wanting immediate answers constantly. I wanted every experience categorized immediately. I wanted certainty. And the irony is, that urgency actually made clarity harder. Because when you're desperate to define every experience instantly, you start forcing interpretation. And forced interpretation creates distortion. That realization changed everything for me. So let's talk about something important, because I don't want this conversation to stay too abstract. When I first started experiencing things that I would now describe as intuitive or mediumistic, it wasn't subtle. And I want to be careful with language here, because I think in spiritual spaces, there's often pressure to either downplay experiences to sound rational or exaggerate them to sound gifted. And I don't feel interested in either extreme. My experience was real to me. That's the simplest way to say it. I did hear things. I did perceive things. I had moments where information would come in that did not feel like normal thinking. But here's where it gets interesting and honestly a bit uncomfortable at times. Just because something feels real does not automatically mean you understand it. And that distinction is where a lot of confusion begins. At the time, I didn't have language for what I was experiencing. So naturally, my mind tried to categorize everything immediately. And that's where things get a bit chaotic internally, because the human brain is very committed to making meaning. It does not like open loops. So if something unusual happens, the brain will immediately go, okay, what was that? Where did that come from? What category does this belong in? Is this intuition? Is this imagination? Is this something else entirely? And if you're sensitive or reflective by nature, that internal dialogue can become very active. Almost like your mind becomes a full time investigative department, except no one hired them. They just showed up. And I remember there were moments where I would have experiences and then immediately try to solve them. Not understand them, solve them. Like if I just thought hard enough, I would arrive at a final answer. Yes, this is exactly what this means, and now I can categorize my entire reality accordingly. But spiritual experience doesn't really work like that. It doesn't behave like a puzzle that resolves neatly. It behaves more like something that expands your awareness over time, which is very inconvenient for a mind that prefers certainty on demand. And I'll be honest, there is something slightly funny about looking back on that phase, because I can see now how serious I was about trying to figure everything out immediately. Like I was internally treating every experience like it had urgent academic importance. Meanwhile, externally, I was just living life, doing normal things, acting like everything was fine, and internally thinking, okay, so either reality is much more complex than I was taught, or I've somehow become the world's most confused person. Sometimes both felt equally plausible. And I think this is where a lot of people actually get stuck, because they assume that if something is spiritual or intuitive, it should come with immediate clarity. But what I've learned is clarity is usually not the first stage. Confusion is. Awareness is often the first stage. Understanding comes later. And this is where I want to bring something very grounded into this conversation, because strong experiences, whether intuitive, emotional, psychological, or spiritual, do not automatically come with interpretation built in. They come raw, unfiltered. And then the mind has to learn how to work with them. That's the part people don't always talk about. They talk about receiving information, but not about what happens after you receive it. Because that's where the real development actually begins. And if I'm being completely honest, There were moments where I questioned myself quite a lot, not because I didn't experience things, but because I didn't yet understand how to relate to them. And there's a difference between something is happening and I understand what is happening. That gap is where most people live at the beginning. And I want to pause here for a second because I think this is important. A lot of people in spiritual development assume that confidence should come first. But in reality, confidence is usually something that develops after you learn how to observe your experiences without immediately forcing meaning onto them. And that's a skill, not a trait, not a gift, a skill. And I know for some people listening, this might sound surprisingly practical for a spiritual conversation, but that's intentional because I don't believe spirituality and practicality are opposites. I think clarity is spiritual and confusion is just unorganized awareness, which sounds slightly less poetic, but is often more useful. So, in the beginning, for me, there was this strange duality. On one hand, real experiences, strong perceptions, moments of clarity. And on the other hand, doubt, interpretation overload, mental noise, trying to define everything too quickly. And those two things existing at the same time is actually very normal, even if it doesn't always get acknowledged. And I think this is also where humor started to naturally enter my experience later on. Because if you don't learn to laugh at how seriously your mind takes itself sometimes, it becomes very heavy very quickly. There's something oddly grounding about realizing I am having a profound existential moment while also forgetting where I put my keys. That contrast matters. It keeps things human. And that's really what I want this podcast to hold. Not separation from reality, but integration with it. So, at some point in my own development, something very important started to become obvious. And it wasn't immediate, it was gradual. Almost like noticing a pattern you didn't see before. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that realization was this: there's a difference between what you perceive and what you think it means. And that might sound simple, but it's actually one of the most important distinctions in spiritual development because most confusion does not come from what people are perceiving. It comes from how quickly they interpret it. Let me explain what I mean. When you have an experience, intuitive, emotional, perceptual, whatever label you want to use, there's usually a very brief moment before the mind steps in, a very small window. And in that window, there is pure perception. No story yet, no meaning yet, just awareness of something. And then the mind enters, and the mind is very enthusiastic about its job. It immediately begins categorizing, comparing, analyzing, interpreting, predicting, sometimes overcorrecting. And suddenly the experience is no longer just perception. It becomes a story about the perception. And most people never notice that transition. They think, what I felt was the meaning. But often, what they felt was just the raw input, and meaning came afterward. And this is where things can get a little funny when you observe it closely, because the mind is extremely confident. Even when it has no real evidence yet, it will take a small impression and turn it into a full explanation almost instantly. It's like, I sensed something, therefore I now have a complete theory of consciousness and possibly 3 conclusions about my entire life path. Very efficient, not always accurate. And I started noticing this in myself, that I wasn't just receiving impressions, I was immediately interpreting them, sometimes within seconds. And the interpretation felt just as real as the perception, which made things confusing. Because I didn't realize I was layering meaning on top of raw experience so quickly. And once I started slowing that process down, something interesting happened. The experiences didn't necessarily change, but my relationship to them did. There was more space, more observation, less urgency to define everything immediately. And this is where development actually begins to shift. Not when experiences become stronger, but when interpretation becomes slower. And I want to be very clear here. Slowing down interpretation does not mean ignoring intuition. It means learning the difference between something is being perceived and what I think that perception means. Those are two separate steps. And this distinction alone removes a lot of confusion for people because suddenly you stop asking, am I right or wrong? And instead you start asking, what exactly did I perceive before I interpreted it? That is a completely different level of awareness. And honestly, this is also where things became more grounded for me personally. Because instead of constantly trying to validate every impression immediately, I started observing patterns over time. Not one moment, not one experience, patterns. And patterns are much more reliable than isolated moments. And I think this is something that doesn't get emphasized enough in spiritual development spaces. People often focus on individual messages, single experiences, isolated moments of clarity, but real understanding comes from repetition, from noticing consistency, from tracking how your awareness behaves over time. And I remember at a certain point realizing, oh, I don't need to solve every experience. I just need to observe how my perception behaves. And that shifted everything because suddenly I wasn't in a rush anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything in real time. I was learning. And there's something very freeing about that. Because when you remove urgency, you create space. And in that space, clarity actually has room to form naturally. And I'll say something slightly honest here. A lot of confusion in spiritual development is not actually spiritual confusion. It's interpretive speed. People are simply interpreting faster than they are observing, and that creates noise. And when you slow that down, something very interesting happens. You start to notice subtle differences in thought quality, differences between emotional impressions and clear impressions, differences between memory and perception, differences between imagination and observation. And those differences matter a lot. And this is where mediumship or intuitive awareness in general starts to feel less like mystery and more like skill. Not because it becomes less profound, but because it becomes more understood. And I think that's where I want to pause this section because this is the foundation of everything that comes next. If you can begin to separate perception from interpretation, you start building real clarity, not just experiences, but understanding. So now we get into one of the most talked about and honestly most misunderstood parts of spiritual development, the difference between intuition and mediumship. And I want to start by saying something very simple. Most people are not actually confused because they lack ability. They're confused because they're trying to label experience too quickly. Because when you start becoming more aware of your inner world, something happens that nobody really prepares you for. Everything starts to feel meaningful. And I do mean everything. A thought, a feeling, a memory, a random image in your mind, a song lyric, a passing impression. And suddenly your mind goes, okay, what was that? And then immediately, was that intuition? Was that spirit? Was that just me thinking? Was that symbolic? Was that my subconscious? Was that a message? Was that absolutely nothing? And you can see how this becomes very quickly a full-time job, internally, unpaid, no benefits. And I remember going through that phase and realizing something quite important. I wasn't actually lacking sensitivity. I was lacking discernment structure. There was awareness happening, but no system for understanding it. So let's slow this down. Intuition. Intuition is internal awareness. It comes from subconscious pattern recognition, emotional intelligence, memory, life experience, sensory sensitivity. It is you processing you, even when it feels sudden. It is still arising from within your own system. Mediumship, in the way we are defining it here, is the perception of information that does not feel generated from your personal thought process. It feels like information arriving, impressions forming without reasoning, awareness that feels given rather than constructed. But here's the key: it still has to pass through your mind. So it will always be interpreted through your human system, which is where things get messy. Because what happens is this: perception arrives, mind interprets it, emotion reacts, identity assigns meaning. And suddenly, what was a simple impression becomes a full internal narrative. And this is where people start to struggle because they assume if it's real, I should know immediately what it is. But that's not how perception actually works. Not even in everyday life. Think about it. You can walk into a room and feel something shift in the atmosphere before you consciously understand what changed. That's perception. But the interpretation comes later. Oh, they're arguing. Oh, there's tension. Oh, something happened before I walked in. The perception is immediate. The understanding is delayed. Spiritual perception is no different. It just carries more sensitivity and therefore more room for misinterpretation. And this is where I want to bring in something a bit honest and slightly funny again, because in early development, people often start treating every internal impression like it requires urgent investigation. So suddenly, a random thought about water becomes a symbolic life message. A feeling in your chest becomes a spiritual confirmation. A memory becomes a sign. A coincidence becomes a cosmic event. And at some point, your mind is basically, everything is significant. Nothing is safe. We are now in a permanent state of spiritual analysis. And that's exhausting. And what I learned over time is that clarity doesn't come from interpreting more. It comes from interpreting less, but more accurately. So here's a clearer way to hold it. Intuition equals internal processing plus awareness plus pattern recognition. Mediumship as experience equals perception that feels externally sourced, but still filtered through human interpretation. But the key point is this: neither one is instantly pure. Both require observation, both require reflection, both require time. And this is where people often get frustrated because they want certainty immediately. But development doesn't usually offer certainty at the beginning. It offers awareness first, then refinement, then clarity. And something important started to shift for me when I stopped trying to label everything instantly. Instead of asking, "What is this?" I started asking, "What happens when I observe this without rushing to define it?" And that changed everything because suddenly there was space. And in that space, patterns became clearer. And I want to emphasize something here. Discernment is not about doubting yourself. It's about slowing down interpretation so accuracy can emerge naturally. That's a very different internal posture. One is fear-based, the other is awareness-based. And over time, what starts to happen is you begin to recognize this feels like memory. This feels like imagination. This feels like emotional projection. This feels like something different. But because you've observed enough patterns to recognize differences, and that's really the foundation of everything we call development, not constant experiences, but refined perception. So now we need to talk about something that plays a much bigger role in spiritual confusion than most people realize. And that is the environment we are learning in. Because right now, most people are not developing their intuition or mediumship in silence, or in structured training, or in contained environments. They are developing it in a very loud, very fast, very visually saturated online space. And that changes everything. Because when I started exploring these experiences, there wasn't the same level of constant external input. You had your own experience, your own reflection, your own process. But now people are constantly being exposed to spiritual clips, intuitive readings, dramatic messages, aestheticized spirituality, quick interpretations of complex experiences. And all of that starts to shape expectations, even unconsciously. So instead of asking, what am I experiencing? People start asking, does my experience look like that? And that is a very different question because comparison changes perception, not because your experience changes, but because your interpretation of it changes. And I think this is where a lot of confusion begins quietly. Someone has a subtle intuitive impression, but because it doesn't feel dramatic or visually intense or emotionally overwhelming like something they saw online, they dismiss it. They think, that can't be. That was too normal. But that assumption is based on exposure, not accuracy. And this is something I've noticed repeatedly. The more someone consumes spiritual content online, the more their internal expectations become shaped by external presentation. And over time, this creates a subtle distortion, not because the content is bad, but because it is performative by nature. It has to be. Short form content requires impact, it requires immediacy, it requires clarity in a few seconds. But real perception does not always behave like that. And I'll be honest, there is something slightly ironic about it because people are trying to become more intuitive while simultaneously consuming content that encourages instant interpretation. So they're training two opposite processes at the same time. One is slow awareness, the other is fast meaning making. And these two systems do not blend easily. And I remember at a certain point realizing I'm not actually confused about my experiences. I'm confused because I'm trying to understand them through too many external frameworks at once. And that was a very grounding realization because when you remove external comparison for a moment, something interesting happens. Your own perception becomes clearer, not louder, not more dramatic, just clearer. And this is also where people often mistake simplicity for nothing happening because they expect spiritual development to feel intense, constant, emotionally overwhelming, visually or energetically obvious. But often, real development is more subtle than that. It's internal calibration. It's noticing differences in quality of awareness. It's recognizing when something feels internally consistent versus when it feels emotionally constructed. And none of that is flashy, which is why people sometimes miss it. And I think this is where modern spirituality unintentionally creates pressure, because it often presents a version of spiritual experience that is immediate, visually symbolic, emotionally expressive, constantly meaningful, and then real life experience feels comparatively quiet. So people assume if it's not like that, it must not be real. But that's not necessarily true. It may just be unfiltered. And I want to say something here very clearly. There is nothing wrong with expressive spirituality, nothing wrong with symbolism, nothing wrong with dramatic experiences. But problems begin when we assume that is the standard, because then anything quieter gets dismissed. And that's where people lose trust in themselves unnecessarily. And I've seen this lead to a very common pattern. People begin to override their own perception in favor of what they think it should look like. And once you start doing that, you stop actually observing your experience. You start editing it mentally. And over time, that creates disconnection, not from spirituality, but from your own awareness. And I think that's why grounded frameworks matter so much, because they bring you back to something simple. What did I actually perceive before I interpreted it? That question alone cuts through a lot of noise. And this is also where discernment becomes incredibly important, not in a rigid way, but in a stabilizing way, because discernment is what allows you to stay connected to your own experience without constantly outsourcing interpretation. And that's really what this phase of development is all about. Not collecting more experiences, but learning how to trust your own observation again. So let's get back to something very realistic for a moment, because when we talk about perception and intuition and interpretation like this, it can start to feel quite abstract if we stay there too long. But the truth is, you're still just a person living a normal life in the middle of it all. And that doesn't really change no matter how much awareness you develop. Like, you can be in the middle of a very reflective moment about consciousness or awareness or perception, and then immediately realize you've been looking for your phone while it's literally in your hand. And there's something about that that is actually very grounding, because it pulls everything back into reality in a very simple way. It reminds you you're not observing life from somewhere outside of it, you're in it, very much in it. And I think this is where spirituality gets a bit misunderstood sometimes. Because people assume that if you're intuitive or sensitive or developing awareness, you become less human somehow. But honestly, it's the opposite. You don't become less human. You just become more aware of how human you are. Your patterns, your reactions, your assumptions, your overthinking. All of it becomes a little more visible. Not in a dramatic way, just in a clearer way. And I'll be honest, there were moments early on where I would have a very small internal impression, and my mind would immediately escalate it into something much bigger. Like, it would go, okay, this means something. This is important. We need to understand this right now. And meanwhile, it was probably just a subtle perception passing through awareness. But the mind doesn't always do subtle very well. The mind prefers things to mean something very quickly. It likes certainty, it likes conclusions, it likes this is everything or this is nothing. There's not a lot of middle ground at first. And I started noticing something a bit funny about that over time, which is that my mind could take something very simple and turn it into a full internal investigation almost instantly. Like, I'd have one impression and suddenly I'm mentally analyzing it from every possible angle at 2 a.m., while also still not knowing where I put my keys. So there's this very human contrast happening the whole time. Deep internal reflection and also normal everyday chaos, both existing at once. And I think that contrast is actually important because it keeps everything grounded. It stops things from becoming too detached or too abstract, but it also gently reminds you not to take every internal experience as something that requires immediate meaning, because not everything is meant to be solved instantly. Some things are meant to be observed first, and that is a very different internal posture. And when I started slowing that down, not rushing to interpret everything immediately, something interesting happened. Things actually became clearer. Not louder, not more intense, just clearer. And I think that's where humor naturally starts to come in as well, because when you really start observing your own mind, you notice how quickly it can take something small and make it very serious, even when the situation doesn't actually require that level of intensity. And at some point, You either get overwhelmed by that or you learn to gently laugh at it, not in a dismissive way, just in a very human way. Like, okay, I see what my mind is doing here. And somehow that softens everything. And I think that's really what this part of development is all about. It's not about becoming less sensitive, and it's not about shutting anything down. It's about becoming more able to stay present with your awareness without immediately needing to define it. So you're not constantly trying to force meaning out of every moment. You're just experiencing it, observing it, letting it be what it is before deciding what it means. And that actually brings a lot more stability than people expect because the pressure drops, the urgency drops, and your internal world becomes a little less crowded, a little more spacious. And from that place, things tend to make a lot more sense naturally. Not because you forced clarity, but because you finally gave it room to form. So, if we bring everything we've spoken about today together, what this really comes down to is something quite simple. Evidential mediumship, or intuitive awareness in general, is not actually about constantly trying to figure out what every experience means in real time. It's more about learning how to relate to your own perception without immediately distorting it through interpretation. And that sounds very technical when you say it like that, but in real life, it's actually quite subtle. It looks like noticing something, pausing before assigning meaning, and allowing yourself to observe it a little longer than your mind wants you to. That's it. That's the skill. And I think that's important because a lot of people assume development is about becoming more certain or more clear in a very immediate way. But often it's actually the opposite in the beginning. It's about becoming more comfortable, not rushing to certainty, which for the human mind is not naturally comfortable. The mind prefers answers, it prefers conclusions, it prefers things to feel finished. But awareness doesn't always arrive in finished form. Sometimes it arrives as something unfinished that you're learning how to sit with. And over time, something shifts. You stop trying to turn every moment into meaning, and you start noticing the quality of your perception instead, not what it must mean immediately, but what it actually felt like before you touched it with interpretation. And that distinction is where things begin to become much more stable because you're no longer reacting to every internal experience as if it needs immediate resolution. You're observing it first, and that creates space. And in that space, clarity actually starts to form on its own, not forced, just naturally. And I think that's really what development becomes, not accumulation, not constant breakthroughs, not constant intensity, but refinement. Subtle refinement of how you perceive, how you interpret, and how quickly you attach meaning to what you experience. And when you remove that pressure to constantly define everything immediately, something interesting happens. Your experience becomes lighter, not less meaningful, just less pressured. And there's a difference. So I want to leave you with something very simple as we close the first episode. If you've listened to all of this and you're thinking, I'm not sure what I've been experiencing, but I've definitely been overthinking it, you're not alone in that. That's actually a very normal part of becoming more aware. Because awareness without structure can feel overwhelming at first, and interpretation without pause can create confusion very quickly. But nothing about that means you're doing anything wrong. It just means you're learning how your own awareness works. And that takes time. Not urgency, not pressure, just time. And if there's one thing I would want you to take from this episode, it's this. You don't need to rush to define every experience you have internally. You can allow yourself to observe first and understand later. Because clarity doesn't usually come from forcing answers. It comes from giving yourself enough space to actually see what's happening before you decide what it is. And honestly, that applies not just to spiritual development, but to life in general. We tend to move very quickly into interpretation in almost everything we do. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is slow that process down just enough to actually experience things before labeling them. And if you can start there, even a little bit, things tend to become much clearer over time. Not louder, not more dramatic, just clearer. So I'm really glad you're here for this first episode. This is the beginning of a much bigger conversation we're going to have together about awareness, perception, intuition, and what it actually means to develop yourself in a grounded way without losing your humanity in the process. If this resonated with you, you can continue your development through Alpha Mediumship Academy, and you'll find the link in the show notes. And I'll see you in the next episode.